Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another exciting episode of From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. Hi, Nan.
Hi, Steve.
You know, we talk about movies a lot. We talk about where we get our love from movies. And I think I've mentioned this a lot, but when I was growing up, one of the things that bonded my father and me was old movies. These great classic films gave us an excuse to hang out together. We could just sit in the den for hours and feel this communal closeness without having to talk too much or get too personal, which I'm sure probably suited my dad just fine.
Of a generation, right?
Exactly. He was not a man. He was not a man to speak too openly about his feelings. But one of the films that we really loved, and we talked about it on the podcast, was Operation Petticoat from 1959, which starred Cary Grant and Tony Curtis. It's that World War II comedy that was directed by Blake Edwards, and it told the story of the submarine Sea Tiger and its wacky crew. So in the fall of 1977, ABC TV decided to air a 30-minute sitcom based on this film, Operation Petticoat. John Astin stepped in for Cary Grant, and the very funny and very charming Richard Gilliland took on the Tony Curtis role. People may not be familiar with Richard Gilliland, but most people may know he was the husband of Jean Smart.
Right.
Well, like the film, the TV series featured 5 beautiful Army nurses who hitch a ride aboard the Sea Tiger to escape being captured by the enemy. In the TV version, the nurses are played by Yvonne Wilder, who was in the original
West Side Story,
exactly, and Melinda Naud, Dory Thompson, Bond Gideon, who is a lovely actress and a dear friend of mine.
Aww.
And in one of her first TV performances, Jamie Lee Curtis, of course, the daughter of Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh. Well, of course, what could possibly go wrong on a submarine painted pink, loaded with a crew of horny sailors and 5 nurses? Comedy ensued.
Well, and to add to that, remember Jim Varney from the Hey Vern car commercials?
Yes.
He was in it too. How can you go wrong?
Right? I know. It was such a great show, and my dad and I loved it. But I think the thing that really struck me was that we were glued to the tube every Saturday night watching the hijinks of the Sea Tiger. And my dad, who served in the Navy, I think it brought back great memories for him. And he got to explain to me things about how the Navy worked and ranks and hierarchy and, things about the naval ship that he knew that nobody else would know.
Right.
So it really gave me a glimpse into his life and his military experience, and it really brought us closer together. So I have such love for this movie. A little sidebar, actress Jamie Lee Curtis has often spoken about being fired from this show after the first season.
Right.
In fact, almost the entire cast was replaced for season 2, which was a colossal mistake because it then, plummeted in the ratings and only lasted 10 more episodes and was canceled. But Curtis often mentions this firing because had she not been fired from the show, she wouldn't have been available to audition for this little tiny movie called Halloween.
Which kind of started her career.
I know, which of course it changed the trajectory of her career. So maybe getting fired isn't always a bad thing.
Right.
Well, remembering how much fun that my dad and I had watching this great show, it made me start thinking about classic films that were turned into TV shows. There were very successful ones like Peyton Place, Dr. Kildare, Alice, MASH, In the Heat of the Night, Hotel, which we mentioned, The Waltons, and Mr. Belvedere. They all started off as feature films.
Right.
So I wanted to spend time today talking about some other classic films that turned into TV shows, but maybe not quite as successfully.
Yes, and it's timely in that the Emmy Awards will be airing on September 15th. So this kind of gives us a blend of the film world and the TV world, a sort of a mashup.
Yeah, I know. We're going TV, folks.
Let's start with one that it seems like a good idea, Steve.
It seemed on paper.
Right? It's Topper, the original film, 1937, based on Thorne Smith's popular 1926 novel, was a smash hit film starring Cary Grant and Constance Bennett as George and Marion Kirby, this sexy, sophisticated couple. They're killed in an avalanche while skiing. but they don't go right to heaven. And they're in some kind of in-between world where they have to do a good deed to get into the official heaven. So they decide to try to help their pal, who's still on Earth, Cosmos Topper, who's this stuffy banker played by Roland Young. The film, as I mentioned, was a huge hit. It was critically acclaimed as well, nominated for 2 Academy Awards, one for Best Sound Recording, one for Roland Young as Best Actor in a Supporting Role. It inspired sequels. I mean, the things about this just keep going, yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. The sequels were 1938, Topper Takes a Trip, and 39, Topper Returns, which in the former, Topper Takes a Trip, everybody reunited from the original cast except for Cary Grant. And then in Topper Returns, it brings back Roland Young and Billy Burke, who we love.
We love her.
Yes, and Joan Blondell as a new ghost wreaking havoc on the Toppers' lives. But the first time that it was done on television is 1953, and it's with Anne Jeffries and Robert Sterling as George and Marion. CBS brings it to the small screen. It also stars Leo G. Carroll and Lee Patrick as Cosmos and Henrietta Topper.
Despite promising initial reviews and the nice chemistry among the cast, for one thing, Anne Jeffries and Robert Sterling were real-life man and wife.
Aww.
So they had natural chemistry.
Right.
Well, natural chemistry was not enough to save this turkey. It only lasted 2 seasons before being canceled, and despite their appeal, they just didn't have the star power of Cary Grant and Constance Bennett. But then again, who does?
Right, who does? Interesting fun fact. 11 of the episodes were written by, this guy, I think I've heard of him, Stephen Sondheim.
I know. Sondheim got his start in TV.
That's
I don't
crazy.
think a lot of people know that.
Jumping into the next one. How to Marry a Millionaire. 1953 originally starred Betty Grable, Lauren Bacall, Marilyn Monroe, and it's a 20th Century Fox romantic comedy, and it was a fabulous film directed by Jean Negulesco and co-starring William Powell, David Wayne, Rory Calhoun, Cameron Mitchell, and Fred Clark. It's about these 3 lovely Manhattan models hell-bent on marrying millionaires, written by the great Nunnally Johnson. It was the 4th highest grossing film of the year, so of course it would seem perfect to make the transition to television.
No-brainer, right? Well, after Fox shot the pilot, they weren't able to sell it to any of the 3 major television networks.
Okay, doesn't that say something right there? I mean...
That was your first indicator right
can't
there.
Sell it, okay.
Well, they ended up, and this is interesting to me, they ended up selling it directly to over 100 TV affiliates in a syndication deal.
Okay.
Which I'm curious if this is one of the first syndication deals ever done.
Yeah.
Well, it did end up debuting October of 1957. How to Marry a Millionaire on TV starred Mary Anders, Lori Nelson, and the then very unknown Barbara Eden. And they played the 3 likable gold diggers. Well, after 1 season, Lori Nelson quit the show or was fired, depending on who you listen to, and a new roommate was brought in the form of Lisa Gay, the lovely actress and real-life sister of actress Deborah Paget. Well, after a truncated second season of only 13 episodes, the series was canceled with little fanfare. And while the series was no match for the colossal smash hit that the movie was, it did introduce TV viewers to Barbara Eden, who would be back on TV 7 years later as our favorite Jeannie.
Right. Now, this next one we're going to talk about, I find fascinating. I had no idea it was related. The film, The Third Man, 1949 film noir classic, which is a layered mystery about an American writer played by the great Joseph Cotton, who has come to Vienna to start a new job with his friend Harry Lime, played by Orson Welles, only to hear that Lime has been killed. So something fishy's going on, and Cotton's character decides to get to the bottom of it, and he opens a Pandora's box of intrigue and deceit and murder, and it's directed by Carol Reed. It's just a stunning film, killer screenplay by Graham Greene, and a very strong supporting cast, including Trevor Howard. It's also considered and was on my short list for the 40s as a best film, and it certainly remains as on top 10, top 100 lists of best films ever.
Oh, yeah. I think film scholars would put this in the top on any list.
And it did win an Academy Award for Best Cinematography Black and White when they were differentiating the category back then, and was also nominated for Best Director and Best Editing.
Well, a television series version of The Third Man ran in syndication from 1959 to 1965. Obviously taking great liberties with the film, It starred Michael Rennie as Harry Lime, an international private investigator.
Okay.
And of course, as we all know in The Third Man, spoiler alert, Lime dies at the end of the film. But in the TV version, he is resurrected and very much alive.
Right.
Well, the series co-stars Jonathan Harris as his sidekick. And of course, we all know Jonathan Harris, who later played Dr. Smith in the cult TV series Lost in Space.
And Michael Rennie, listeners might remember, best known for the film The Day the Earth Stood Still.
So despite being on the air for 5 seasons, it was never a ratings or critical darling, and it sort of faded away into oblivion.
Wow. Our next film that became a TV show, and we wonder why, is something that started on Broadway in 1940, very popular play called My Sister Eileen, based on a series of short stories written by Ruth McKenney. Then My Sister Eileen was made into a film, not once, but twice. So you've got a Broadway pedigree, 864 performances it ran for. You've got a 1942 film version that starred the great Rosalind Russell and Janet Blair, directed by Alexander Hall. The setting is they're two lovable sisters from Ohio who moved to Manhattan to seek their fortune. And Russell was nominated for an Academy Award as Best Actress for her efforts in that film. My Sister Eileen was remade in 1955 with Janet Leigh and Betty Garrett, which was a comeback of sorts for Garrett, who hadn't appeared in film in 6 years due to being unofficially blacklisted along with her husband Larry Parks during the Red Scare of the early 1950s. And it was also made into a Broadway musical, Wonderful
right.
Town, with again Rosalind Russell and Edie Adams in the film version.
Well, TV wanted a piece of that.
They sure did.
CBS TV, they decided to base a sitcom on these popular movies. And who better to fill Roz Russell's shoes than future Broadway legend Elaine Stritch? Her younger sister was portrayed by Shirley Bond, and also comedian Stubby Kaye played the theatrical agent, and screen veteran Agnes Moorehead recurred as the girl's Aunt Harriet.
Oh, she would be perfect.
Perfect. And also, and I love this, it featured Rosemary from the Dick Van Dyke Show, who played a coworker. So great cast. But you know, despite the great cast, despite the film pedigree, everything appealing about it, the show was programmed against the top-rated show Hawaiian Eye and was canceled after only 1 season.
That is just tragic.
Too bad.
Yeah. Well, we have many, many more titles to talk about. But before we do that, let's hear this week's question to our Hollywood Pop Quiz.
And the question is, one of the movies that was turned into a not-so-successful TV show was The Greatest Show on Earth.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, we love the movie. It starred Charlton Heston, who took on the Charlton Heston role for the TV version.
Oh, good question. All right, we'll be right back with the answer right after this.
You know the drill. Steve and Ann will be right back, but first, another stop on the Hollywood tour. Now, Alfred Hitchcock was known for really pushing boundaries and trying inventive ways to tell his stories. Many people think he might be the best director in Hollywood history. But whether he was or not, there's one milestone in modern cinema that's very plainly his, and it had never been done before. Can you guess what it was? Here's a hint. It was in 1960's Psycho. Now, you may not believe it, but Psycho is the very first modern film in American history to show a toilet on screen. It's also the first American film in which we hear a toilet being flushed. Before then, censors wouldn't allow it. Thank God we got over that hurdle, huh? Now back to Steve and Ann from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
Welcome back. We have some other great series we're going to talk about that started out as classic movies. But before we do, I wanted to give a big shout out to our listener of the week. And this week, we are giving a shout out to Vicky Perez. Vicky, thank you for the support. Thank you for the great email. Vicky's a big fan of The Women.
Oh.
And she agreed with us that maybe that remake shouldn't have been made.
Yes, well, I'm already besties with Vicky because I love that movie.
Thank you, Vicky.
Thanks, Vicky. Diving back in, let's kick it off with The Farmer's Daughter, the film from 1947 starring Joseph Cotten and Loretta Young. Now, this is the tale of the simple farm girl, and we all know Loretta Young is a simple farm girl, right?
She just reeks simple farm girl.
Yes, exactly. Well, she goes to work for a political powerhouse played by Ethel Barrymore and her congressman's son, played by Joseph Cotten, along with their faithful butler, played by Charles Bickford. They are all enchanted by Loretta Young's common sense and practicality, and of course, Joseph Cotten soon falls for her.
Of course.
Complicating things in the most charming and romantic way. Now, the 47 film was directed by H.C. Potter, and it was written by Alan Rivkin and Laura Kerr. In a bit of an Oscar shocker, Loretta Young won the Best Actress Oscar for this film, beating out her good friend and our good friend Rosalind Russell, who never went on to win one.
Yeah, she never did.
Yeah.
And she was so favored that year for Morning Becomes Electra, and she lost.
What a role in Morning Becomes Electra. Anyway, I'm bitter, but it's okay. Charles Bickford was also nominated as Best Actor in a Supporting Role. Once again, great pedigree. Yeah, let's make it a TV series.
Yes. So ABC TV, they decide to make The Farmer's Daughter, the TV show. Liberties were taken with the original story, of course. In the TV series, the congressman is now played by William Wyndham. He's a widower with 2 teen sons.
Okay.
And Inger Stevens steps in for Loretta Young as the Swedish housekeeper turned politician. And Kathleen Nesbitt stars as Wyndham's politically active mother. Although the show lasted 3 seasons, it slowly began to decline in ratings. In the 3rd season, the relationship between the congressman and the housekeeper turned romantic and ends in an engagement. And like so many other shows, the minute that your leads, there's sexual tension and they get together,
right,
people lose interest. And that's what
Yes.
happened here, and the show was canceled.
Well, bye-bye, Farmer's
Bye-bye.
Daughter. Next, we have one that I remember as a kid. Please Don't Eat the Daisies. I never knew as a kid that it was a classic film.
Yeah, me either. I saw the TV show first.
Yes.
And then I discovered
wait a minute.
the Doris Day movie.
Right.
Yeah.
It stars Doris Day and David Niven, 1960. It's a fun fish-out-of-water story about a Manhattan family headed by Doris Day and David Niven decide to move from the hectic pace of the city to a rundown country estate. It's sort of like Mr. Blanding's...
Mr. Blanding builds his dream house.
Yes. It's a similar story.
Yeah.
So the film is directed by Charles Walters. It's based on the popular 1957 book of humorous essays by Gene Kerr. The film features Janice Page, Richard Hayden, Spring Byington, Patsy Kelly, Jack Weston, and Margaret Lindsay.
Who we had just talked about, Margaret Lindsay, in the William Ith story.
Yes.
Interestingly enough.
Yes. NBC decides, let's make this into a TV series.
Yes, let's capture that magic for TV. And they launched a sitcom version of Please Don't Eat the Daisies in 1965. Keeping fairly true to the book and the film, it starred Mark Miller and Patricia Crowley as the Manhattan couple who moved to the country for a less stressful life, only to discover that the tranquility of the country brings about its own chaos.
I thought they had great chemistry together.
They had great chemistry together. The series also featured Dub Taylor and a pre-One Day at a Time Bonnie Franklin. The show did well during its first season, but after it was moved to Saturday night, the slot of death, for season 2, it was trounced in the ratings by the Jackie Gleason Show and was unceremoniously canceled.
Wow. I just remember it in reruns.
I know, and I loved it.
This next one, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, the film is from 1947. It stars Gene Tierney and Rex Harrison. This romantic, supernatural fantasy movie. If you have not seen it, it is a major tearjerker.
So good.
In
so
such a
good.
wonderful way. It's the story of Mrs. Muir, a widow played by Gene Tierney, who moves to a Gothic house in the seaside village of Whitecliff, despite everybody in town claiming that the house is haunted by its previous owner, a sea captain named Daniel Gregg, played by Rex Harrison, who apparently committed suicide. Of course, the sea captain begins making his presence known to Mrs. Muir, and despite their living in different dimensions, they fall in love. Trust me, I know that sounds crazy, but it really is a great film. It's directed by Joseph Mankiewicz, written by Philip Dunn, and it's based on the 1945 novel The Ghost and Captain Gregg and Mrs. Muir by R.A. Dick. And the film also featured this podcast's friend George Sanders, Edna Best, Vanessa Brown, Anna Lee, and Natalie Wood.
Little Natalie played the daughter. She was so good.
So good.
Well, NBC decided to bring the TV series The Ghost of Mrs. Muir to the small screen. They kept the same conceit and characters from the original, but the time and setting were changed. The action now took place in a contemporary American coastal town. However, the sea captain was still from the Victorian age.
Okay.
Hope Lang and Edward Mulhare were cast as Mrs. Muir and Captain Gregg, and the supporting cast included Charles Nelson Riley as the busybody town clerk.
Oh, and isn't he always just such a great busybody?
Oh, he's perfect in this.
I adore him.
And also a great character actress who I just love, Retta Shaw, played Martha, the housekeeper. Well, after its first season, NBC canceled the show due to low ratings, but ABC picked it up and gave it a second chance.
Okay.
So in season 2, though, it was still pretty much beaten every week by Family Affair, the very popular sitcom with Brian Keith. So ABC canceled it after the completion of the second season, and that was the end of The Ghost and Mrs. Muir on TV.
And just a couple, can I share a couple little side notes? Okay, so Edward Mulhare, he actually understudied Rex Harrison on Broadway as Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady.
No way.
Yes, and so he's now, it's almost like he's a little bit of a lookalike.
Well, they're very similar.
They're very similar.
Even their voices are very, very similar.
Yes. And then just going back to the original film, Lindsay and I saw it a few years back, and we were just bereft at the end of it. And he reminded me that this was one of his mother's favorite films.
Aww.
And the best line in the film, and maybe one of the top best lines ever in a film, is, "You'll never be tired again." Oh. Yeah.
That puts a dagger through your heart.
I know, right? Sorry. Okay, let's uplift. Let's move on to this next one.
Oh, this next one.
It is kind of the most ridiculous.
It's really ridiculous.
Would you not say?
I would say
yes.
This should never have happened.
And it didn't only happen once. It happened twice. Folks, they tried to make a TV show out of Casablanca.
Who thought that was a good idea?
I don't know. I mean, this is, of course, the 1942 epic romantic war drama. It's consistently on lists of the best films ever made. It's directed by the great Michael Curtiz, with a screenplay by Julius J. Epstein, Philip G. Epstein, and Howard Koch, based on the 1940 play Everybody Comes to Rick's by Murray Burnett and Joan Allison. Do I need to tell the complex story? I guess I will just really quickly.
Yeah, for those who haven't seen it, and if you haven't seen it, shame on you, go see it.
Humphrey Bogart plays Rick Blaine, an expat who owns a nightclub in Casablanca. You say Casa, I say Casa, and must decide whether to get involved in the war effort when his old flame Ilsa, played by the spectacular Ingrid Bergman, and her husband Victor Laszlo, played by Paul Henreid, show up at his cafe, trailed by the Nazis, and they ask Rick for his help. I mean, okay. And they decide to make this into a TV show.
Who in their right mind would ever think it's a good idea to turn this iconic movie into a TV series? Well, apparently ABC did. But first of all, there was a first ill-advised attempt to bring this to screen in 1955. In that version, film noir actor Charles McGraw tried to fill Bogart's shoes, but the home viewers just weren't interested. It also ran again for ABC in April of 1983. It ran for 10 episodes, and this one was produced by David L. Wolper, who thought Casablanca had a good shot at being a good TV show. But he cast David Soul from Starsky and Hutch in the Humphrey Bogart role.
Now, and some people we love our David Soul.
We love Starsky and Hutch. We love David Soul.
But not for this role.
No, not for this role. Well, the supporting cast was pretty interesting. It was Hector Elizondo, Ray Liotta, and Scatman Crothers.
Oh, wow. That is a good cast.
It's a great supporting cast. You know, there's not a lot to say about this series, but I'll just say this. David Soul is no Humphrey Bogart, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
The show was canceled after the third of 5 produced episodes, but there was a consolation prize. It won an Emmy for cinematography that year.
Now, who played the Ingrid Bergman role?
There was no Ingrid Bergman role. They cut her out.
That's what they needed.
They cut her out.
They needed Nan McNamara in there.
Right.
That's what they needed. All right. There's just so many others. Can we just run through a quick list of some of these? Okay. They made a series out of Naked City.
Yeah.
Mr. Lucky. The Thin Man.
Who thought that was a good idea?
I know, right? I mean, there were multiple movies of The Thin Man. 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. Father of the Bride. Executive Suite.
Yes.
Adam's Rib. Come on, people. Tammy. Flamingo Road. Well, and that had Mark Harmon, so that one I can sort of see.
That's right. And Morgan Fairchild.
Yes, who doesn't love that combo? Mr. Roberts, 12 O'Clock High, so many others.
Yeah. Did you mention Adam's Rib?
I did.
You did.
That's a crazy one, too.
It was Blythe Danner and Ken Howard.
Yes.
Which actually, I love the idea of them together.
I love the idea of them together, too.
But apparently nobody else did.
Yeah.
It didn't last long.
Yeah. Well, this has been really eye-opening. I think that's the right word. Thanks, everybody, for sharing this time with us.
For every MASH, there's a Mr. Lecky.
Well, let's give the answer to this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
Yes, and the question was, in The Greatest Show on Earth, we all love the movie with Charlton Heston. In the ill-fated TV version, who filled in for Charlton Heston as the lead? Well, it was...
Yes.
Jack Palance.
Oh!
Yeah, which, I can see that.
I can definitely see that.
He had that kind of quality that Heston had.
Yeah. I would think that would have been an expensive show to produce for TV.
With the animals, the circus.
Dear Lord, yeah, and the insurance alone, right? The acrobats. Yeah.
We've got a wayward elephant headed toward Jack Palance.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star review and follow us on social media. Our handle is @FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and you can watch the podcast on YouTube.
And we'd love to hear from you. If there's other classic films that were turned into TV series that we missed, please let us know. We love hearing this stuff. You can reach us at info@FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com.
And sorry for any names that we mispronounced. That's this week's View.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review. And tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor Lindsay Schnebley. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. That's a wrap.